Thank you for joining us for Conversations with KidCare Canada. With us in the studio is Dr. Joanna, a psychiatrist and gifted instructor. And I'm pretty sure you will see how her approach, which is compassionate and non-judgmental, is affecting the life positively of thousands of families. We have a jam-packed session, but don't worry, because you will be able to have the full comments on our website after the show. Joanna, hello. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm grateful to be here.
So before we begin, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
As you mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist, and I have a special interest in psychotherapy, that's talk therapy and mindfulness. And I work a lot with new parents, both in pregnancy and the postpartum period, with moms and dads. I'm also work with a lot of people with complicated mood, anxiety, personality, and complex trauma disorders. And I'm a clinical assistant professor with the University of British Columbia and the Faculty of Medicine, where I teach and do some research. And I think most importantly, I'm a parent, and I'm in the wild and wonderful years of having a 3- and 4-year-old boy at home with me.
There's a lot of talk about happiness these days, but you say that we have evolved to survive, not to be happy. What does that mean?
Yeah, I've taken that line from Dr. Ronald Siegel, a mindfulness teacher, and he talks a lot about how the human condition, we struggle a lot with this double-edged sword of having a human mind. And he gives the illustration of looking back to our ancestors when we were looking back into the savannah and saying, is that a lion or is that a rock? Those of us who kind of said, oh, don't worry, be happy, it's just a rock, let's keep dancing. Well, those weren't really our ancestors. Our ancestors were the ones that were really worried, quickly had the fight or flight response, got prepared, and became quite anxious. And those were more likely to survive. And so this survival technique is actually a strategy that unfortunately allows us to survive, but maybe not so much to be happy. We call this the negativity bias, this idea that we don't see the 99 things that are potentially okay or safe. And so you can see how this could be a problem in this time around pregnancy and the postpartum period, when there's a lot of potential things that could potentially go wrong, and a lot of ways when we might not feel like we're a good enough parent. Similarly, with that, we're also tribal species. And so if you look that we need to survive by staying in our tribes, so we're constantly keeping an eye out for how do we fit in, do I belong, am I enough? Constantly looking out for rejection. So this negativity bias has been very helpful in many ways, and at the same time, it causes a lot of suffering for us, that we're constantly focused on those things that could be quite terrifying or quite shaming. Even if this one moment feels safe, that we have this ability of our mind to look into the past and then to look into the future. And so even though if we're sitting on a calm Sunday morning, just looking into our beautiful eyes of our baby, we might think of all the things that we said 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago and feel shame around that and ruminate about that experience. Or we might look at our baby and think, oh my goodness, there's so many potential ways they could hurt themselves or die in their lifetime. And we can become very preoccupied with this past and this future, and it can be extremely painful. This is what we call the default mode network. This is an area that we've learned through neurosciences recently, that when we're not in the present, we go and start hunting in the past and the future for potentially difficult or problematic things. And this can be very painful and very personal. In fact, in anxiety and mood disorders, we find that people spend more time in this difficult place, in this very painful and personal default mode network. And then there's one more problem that we have with our minds, is that the sense that with a physical condition, we're often compassionate towards ourselves. We might take a day off, go into bed, people would support us. But when we have any mental health struggles, we tend to notice that we're quite hard on ourselves. We experience shame for having them, or we get angry at ourselves, or we just try to get rid of them or push them away, rather than experiencing compassion and kindness towards our experience. So we talk about this being the second arrow, that it's the extra arrow that we throw against ourselves, which adds even more suffering to our experience. So you can see how anxiety is an everyday situation, that we've kind of evolved to become more anxious. It's quite common, and I'm going to be talking about anxiety disorders, but everybody feels anxiety somewhere on the spectrum. It's not something that is only seen in this certain population of people, but it's really part of the human condition and an everyday experience. So there are a lot of different kinds of anxiety disorders, and some of them that present more in the period when we're expecting or in the postpartum period is first generalized anxiety disorder. In generalized anxiety disorder, we focus on a lot of generalized worries. So there's not a specific worry. It might be worried about safety or illness or finances or just everyday performance, usually around themes of uncertainty. And we often find that there's a lot of accompanying symptoms such as irritability, problems with concentration, problems with fatigue, as it's exhausting being in this state all the time. A lot of body symptoms like gastrointestinal problems, headaches, muscle tension, muscle body aches, and also problems with insomnia and lots of other things that actually really resemble pregnancy and the postpartum period. So often it's missed, it's just shrugged off as like, well, I'm not sleeping, so I guess this is probably nothing, or this is just how I'm supposed to be feeling.
Now you've chosen a video clip where we get to hear some mums who are talking about how they're feeling with their anxiety. So let's take a look at that now.
I took a big load on me, expecting I can handle it by myself and not asking for help.
So there we were, my husband and I, with a brand new baby in our house and no other supports.
I started feeling really, really anxious. And I think from that moment on, it just started getting worse.
From there, it was just like this incredible blur of learning how to care for a baby. It really just felt incredibly overwhelming.
What I worried about the most was that I was doing something wrong, that the gut instinct I had listened to that told me, you know, she's okay, she doesn't need more food, or she needs to be cuddled or not, or, you know, all her needs, I began second guessing and wondering whether I wasn't doing something right or I wasn't fit.
You feel like people assume you already, you know, like you're a working woman, working professional, you should know what you're doing, or this is your second child, so you know what to do and you should just be doing it. Like there's this automatic assumption.
I didn't know what to do. And at the same time, I was like, how can I not know what to do? I've always known what to do. That's my thing. I know what to do. So that was really hard.
At the time, I didn't realize that I was being isolated. I was staying home. The house wasn't being cleaned. The laundry wasn't getting done. My windows were closed. I barely answered the phone. Those were some of the cues that the health nurse picked up. And she strongly suggested for me to develop a support system.
Having close friends, it's so important.
Really put a voice to your feelings, to be able to reach out for help. That you don't have to feel guilty in asking for help. Help is good.
So those mums were talking about many of the things that you've been talking about. I think you wanted to tell us about some other aspects.
There are other anxiety conditions that can come up in this period or in any period of life. The next one that we see quite often are panic attacks, or it can even go into a panic disorder. So a panic attack happens when we're anxious. We tend to have a lot of body symptoms, as I was mentioning. Sometimes our heart races. We kind of have our fight or flight response going on. Adrenaline is pumping out. We're kind of ready to attack that lion and to protect ourselves. So we might notice sweatiness, or we might notice our mind going blank, dry mouth, shortness of breath. And in someone with a panic attack, they might interpret those body symptoms as being dangerous. And they say, oh no, what are these body symptoms? Maybe I'm having a heart attack. Maybe I'm losing control. Maybe I'm going crazy. And the more they have these interpretations, the more it actually dumps out more adrenaline and more fight or flight response. And then they interpret that again as dangerous. And so it kind of just turns into this positive feedback loop where it ends up in this full-blown panic attack, which is extremely terrifying. And it often feels like we're dying of a heart attack, we're dying of a stroke, or losing control, or going crazy. And unfortunately, some of the strategies that we naturally try to use to deal with them might actually make panic attacks worse. We might try to avoid things that could potentially make us panic, which makes our lives quite small, and it makes the world just feel more scary because we can't prove to ourselves that we can cope in those situations. Or we might start to hyper-monitor our body, looking for noise and saying, oh, is my heart racing? Is this a panic attack? And yet that kind of monitoring will actually make us have a panic attack again. So that can turn into quite a challenging cycle. There's also social anxiety disorder, which is when we have social focuses. We talked about not wanting to get kicked out of the tribe and how natural that is, and kind of this fear around those sorts of themes. And then finally, in this period, we see a lot of obsessive-compulsive disorder. And usually we think of contamination fears, kind of people having obsessions about germs, and a compulsion to need to wash your hands. That obsessions are recurrent, intrusive, distressing thoughts that are unwanted. And compulsions are also repetitive behaviors as a way to try to get rid of the anxiety from having those obsessions. And so new parents might notice that they have obsessions that perhaps their baby is dying and they can't get that thought out of their head. They might need to have the compulsion of having multiple ultrasounds, needing to count kicks obsessively, or they might notice that they can't let their baby sleep because they're worried that they won't wake up, and needing to frequently check their baby, or not allowing themselves to sleep because it's too scary that maybe their baby won't wake up.
So would this be mums only, or could it happen to dads?
It can happen
or
in
partners?
both mums, dads, and partners, yes, in everyone. And in particular, there's one that we see quite often in partners too, in addition to mothers, is something we call harm OCD. It's a subtype of OCD that looks at, feels that people have obsessions around harm of their baby, or sometimes even harm of other people or themselves. And in this, we know that with OCD, that there's been studies to show that 80% of us have these kind of funny, odd thoughts at times. We're holding a baby and we have an image of dropping them, or we're in a car accident and we kind of have the thought in our head, what would happen if I just drove across the street or off this bridge? Or even if we're really having a really challenging night and our baby's screaming right at us, we have this thought of shaking the baby or losing control. Not that we would do it, but just this image kind of comes into our mind. So people without OCD don't really think much about that, and it just kind of passes. It's not a big deal in their mind. But people who are living with OCD, they both make a lot of judgments on themselves for having that thought. They tend to be extremely morally conscious. So they think, oh, I'm a bad parent. I must be dangerous for having this thought. Or they attribute a lot of responsibility and truth to having that thought, that if I had this thought, then maybe it's true. And so they try to push it out of their minds because they're really scared of this thought. But what we know is whatever you do, don't think of a pink elephant. That's the first thing that happens, is it comes right into our mind. So the more that we try to push thoughts out of our mind, the more they actually come back. And people with OCD can find that they're haunted by this thought. It consumes them throughout the day. Often they're really afraid to ask for help because they worry that maybe their children will be taken away or that they are a danger. Or sometimes they even avoid their children or avoid driving or bathing or even holding knives in fear that what if I might harm them. I've had people come to the emergency room or to the jail to say, admit me, there's something wrong with me, this is terrifying. And we quickly tell them, no, this is OCD. And the reason that we know it's different from other conditions is that OCD, you do not want to have the thoughts. We talk about this being ego dystonic, or it's really dissonant to your true beliefs and your true wishes, your true values. It's very different too from when we see very severe depression or severe psychotic illnesses in new parents, when the thoughts themselves become quite distorted and they actually do believe that their child or themselves would be better off dead. And this is a medical emergency and needs urgent treatment. And it's very different from harm OCD when you're having these really distressing thoughts about harm to the child, but there's no way you'd ever want to have them. No way you'd ever follow through, and it's just not what you want for your children. So one of the things I like to tell the parents I'm working with who have this harm OCD is that they're actually the people that I'm the least worried about for actually harming the child, because they're so distressed by these ideas that it's the opposite of what they would ever act on.
Joanna, thank you. We're going to move to a little break, and when we come back, we have more really interesting information for our viewers.
A child's early years are foundational for lifelong mental and physical health. KidCare Canada Society is a charitable organization incorporated in the province of British Columbia. We seek to empower families to raise their children to be socially and emotionally healthy, and ensure families and those who support them have easy access to relevant, current research at no cost to the end user. Our appealing videos, now being captioned in various languages, feature world-renowned experts and real families. To access these videos and other free resources, log on to KidCareCanada.org.
Welcome back to Conversations with KidCare Canada. Today's topic is anxiety in new parents, the silent epidemic. Could you tell me roughly how common is anxiety in new parents?
It's extremely common. We had a recent study by Dr. Fairbrother and her team coming out of BC that showed that women in pregnancy and postpartum period were about 16 to 17% rate of anxiety disorders. And we know that that's the strict criteria for a disorder. And so the amount of people living with anxiety is much higher than what is able to fulfill those strict criteria. And that's also on par with postpartum depression, which is about 10 to 15%. So it might even be higher than postpartum depression. We also know that partners too experience anxiety disorders. While there isn't quite as much research on this, we do feel that postpartum depression in partners, most of the research has been done on fathers, but partners in general is about 10%. And postpartum anxiety, well, we don't quite know. There has been studies that show even up to 18% of partners have anxiety too. I did want to also add that OCD, which is, I mentioned early on, is actually a high rate of up to 4% in this population. In mothers we've studied, which is more than double the rate in the general population. So we know this is a really high rate during this time of life.
Do we know why?
Yeah, there's quite a few different risk factors for mental health conditions. We like to see it in terms of the biopsychosocial model. So there's a lot of biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors that all come together to create an anxiety or mood disorder or other kind of mental health condition. So we start off with a genetic risk, which is one of our biological factors. Each of us have a different biological makeup, a different genetic risk that's full of lots of hundreds of different genes, that there's not just one or two anxiety genes, but really a whole wide variety of them. And then as we go through life, we accumulate a lot of environmental stressors. So this might be physical illnesses, this might be exposure to stress or trauma, and it also might be how we've been socialized. So perhaps internalizing criticism from others throughout our lives. And then when we go into the pregnancy and the postpartum period, this is times when there's extreme stressors. We talk about the reproductive hormones completely fluctuate, and this has been proven to be a high risk for mood and anxiety problems. There's also a lack of sleep, which we all know is extremely high risk. And then often we lose our nutrition, our exercise, our social roles change significantly. And also our relationships, especially with our partner if we have one. We kind of overnight go from being lovers to coworkers, needing to job share, this idea of watching this baby 24/7, which is really a struggle on our relationship.
One of the things that you've talked about are the dangers of isolation. Is this something that is especially important at this time?
Yes, definitely. When we look at treatment, the first thing that we want to look at is how hard isolation can be. That we do find that shame it's a breeding ground is in isolation. So is anxiety. That sometimes it's the best thing that we need is other people to be able to tell us, oh, don't worry, I feel like that too sometimes. And yet with women and men with anxiety disorders in this parental period, we often find that we're either too anxious to allow others to help us, or we feel like we shouldn't be needing help, or just with the structure of society these days that we just do find we're more isolated and have more distance from family or friends. Linked into that is Kristin Neff. And Kristin Neff speaks about compassion. I just mentioned the third step is compassion. And she's a researcher and a psychologist who's actually really taught us about the power of self-compassion. And self-compassion is so different from self-esteem. Self-esteem is the sense that I'm actually feel better than other people. We're comparing ourselves to others. Well, self-compassion is this idea that, I have weaknesses, I have vulnerabilities, I'm flawed and imperfect just like everyone else. And in fact, taking comfort in that sense of universality. It's in embracing the parts of ourselves that are vulnerable and are feeling hurt, and actually paying more attention to those parts rather than trying to hide them.
So why is treating anxiety so important?
Treating anxiety, we often talk about the side effects of our treatments, especially our medications, which do have some slight dangers to them, of course, but we don't talk about the side effects of untreated mental health problems, especially anxiety and mood conditions in this period that actually have long-term effects on both the mother and the child. We also know that there's what we call epigenetic changes in our babies and in ourselves, that when we have environmental factors, they can actually change the way our genes are expressed. So if a mother is stressed during pregnancy, those stress in utero for the baby can actually affect how their genes are expressed and put them at more risk for different stress responses later in their life and can affect their development. Similarly, anxiety disorders, in addition to mood disorders, they really have an effect on how a parent is able to caregive and attend to their baby, and can affect attachment, which is the foundation of optimal child development. And it's really difficult to be optimally responsive to your child when you're struggling with an anxiety disorder.
I talked a lot about shame and about, and you always say no blame. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's important that actually, even as I say these words about how anxiety might affect your future child, often a lot of parents then feel a lot of shame and potentially even blame for having this anxiety condition. It might make them even more anxious. So it's quite a delicate conversation to have, that we're really framing it in this way that is really related to this perfect storm of risk factors that I just talked about, and that it's not a sign of weakness, it's not our fault. In fact, a lot of these factors are largely out of our control. But what we do have control over is our ability to treat it and to accept treatment.
And you're going to tell us how to do that.
Yeah, I sure am. And so there's a lot of different treatments available, and I think it's first important to notice that there's a difference between anxiety after having a rough night of no sleep and feeling overwhelmed versus having unbearable, distressing symptoms day in and day out for weeks on end. So in mental health, we talk about stepped care, where we match the steps of treatment to the support needed for each parent. So the first step in our step care is the need for lifestyle changes, such as adequate nutrition, exercise, mobilizing a support system, and also getting adequate rest and sleep, which is sometimes impossible in this stage of life, but seeing in what ways can we support a mom or father to be able to do this. A huge part of this first step is recognizing there's a problem and asking for help and mobilizing that help. And we know with mental health conditions that there's often a lot of stigma and shame from speaking out, and that often this shame can be even more painful than living with the condition itself. And so that's something that we need to target. And so I always look at the work of Dr. Brené Brown, who is an amazing shame and vulnerability researcher, and she talks about the antidote to shame as the 3 C's. The first C is the courage to recognize you're in shame and to speak shame. And the second C is to connect to others and share that shame, but with those who deserve it. And the third C is compassion, compassion for ourselves and compassion for others.
So when you say with others who deserve it, what do you mean by that?
Brené Brown is very strong in speaking that we don't need to learn from those who are always going to be the critic, that there might be people who aren't the most supportive to us. And so to really decide who are those that are safe people that will validate our experience and actually be helpful to us. So that's sharing shame with those who deserve it, not putting it on Twitter and waiting for all of those trolls to make negative comments, but to be like, these are the 5 people that I trust their opinion and I trust their feedback.
Joanna, can you tell us a little bit more about how mindfulness can be helpful for parents with an anxiety disorder?
Mindfulness can really help when working with a lot of our worry thoughts. We talked about that negativity bias, how we come up with a lot of really scary stories in our mind that aren't necessarily true or might be really rare occurrences that could happen. So we talk about mindfully labeling our thoughts. We use the term, rather than looking from our thoughts, looking at our thoughts and seeing thoughts just as thoughts. It's not necessarily the truth. That we have this saying, don't believe everything you think. And in this way that we mindfully label thoughts, and then we can return our attention back to the present. Additionally, we have a way of getting out of our head and into our body when we're experiencing difficult emotions. So if we're noticing a lot of anxiety, sometimes it's really magnified by adding the potential future and past to it. And in this way, we can bring ourselves back to the present and say, how does this feel in the body right now? Can I notice the temperature? Is it moving? Is there tension or heaviness? And what about this can't I tolerate? And usually we find that when broken down into the present, that these emotions are tolerable, but it's when we add on all the extra thoughts of the past and present that it makes it quite unmanageable. Another thing that we like to work with is cognitive behavioral therapy, which uses mindfulness but takes it a step further. Again, it's this idea that our thoughts aren't necessarily accurate, and so we kind of ask the question, is this true? Often we find that we'd rather be miserable than uncertain, and we add in a lot of extra stories just to make us feel certain. So rather than saying, I'm noticing I have the thought, my baby's crying, maybe there's something horribly wrong with her, I might say, well, actually, there's a lot of potential things that could be going, I don't know, and this uncertainty is very hard. So we can't control that first automatic thought, but we can create healthier thoughts around it. Also, we look at behavioral strategies. So we find in anxiety disorders, we tend to avoid a lot of things, which is what we call the false promise of avoidance. And the more we try to avoid specific behaviors like leaving the house or bathing our baby or driving, the more frightening they look, because then we don't believe that we can do them because we don't have that evidence from actually coping successfully. So we gradually expose ourselves to those things, and then we build confidence in that way. Finally, there's a kind of therapy called interpersonal therapy, IPT, which looks at our roles and relationships and how they affect our mood and anxiety. So we look at mourning our old roles and kind of adapting to new roles of parenthood. We look at how to assert ourselves more effectively, to communicate our needs and expectations of our partners, and that sort of thing.
What about medications?
So medications are also quite essential, especially when we have a more severe anxiety disorder, when it feels like we're being pounded by a waterfall of difficult thoughts and feelings. And so medications can help bring those down to a point where we can use all these other skills effectively. We often talk about that the risks of not treating often outweigh those of treating the disorder. And medications that we use are very similar to mood disorders, which are the antidepressants or the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the SSRIs.
This little video from the KidCare Canada videos speaks to that.
I decided when I was going back to work, and Cadence was about a year, that because my anxiety and kind of depression symptoms were continuing, to the point where a few times a month I just felt like I was getting hit by a tsunami or a tornado. So it was enough, even for 3 or 4 days at a time, that I felt really rough. And so with my doctor we decided to try an antidepressant. And it was amazing within a week or two how much it changed and lowered my level of anxiety and made me feel more like me, gave me more energy. And I was really lucky I had no side effects with it. And if there were side effects to the medication and I had to go through that, I would just recommend that people persevere and try, you know, different ones out or different doses. And if you don't have a care provider that's really listening to your needs, then find somebody who will.
I wanted to thank you so much for the work that you did on the ABC's book. You've written a section on trauma that I know is very helpful to many people who are working with families. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.